All right, good evening everyone. I am Mark Lodato, Dean of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, and I'd like to welcome everyone to this exciting discussion tonight. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. And I am pleased to welcome the 2021 winners of the Toner Prizes for Excellence in Political Reporting, which recognizes the best U.S. national or local political reporting in any medium or on any platform, print, broadcast, or online. The Toner program was established at the Newhouse School in 2009 to celebrate the life and work of late alumna Robin Toner, who graduated in 1976, the first woman to serve as national political correspondent for the New York Times. Here to introduce our 2021 Toner Prize winners are our moderators for this evening, two Newhouse students, Ghael Fobes and Adriana Rozas Rivera. Ghael is a broadcast and digital journalism senior from Boulder, Colorado and Ciudad del Carmen, Mexico. And since 2019, he has interned with NBC News and MSNBC, covering all things politics and breaking news. On campus, he served as the Toner Program's student assistant since 2018, and he founded the Daily Orange's weekly podcast in 2019. Adriana is a graduate journalism student from Puerto Rico, a 2020 Newhouse Graduate Newspaper Fellow, and a 2021 Pulitzer Center Reporting Fellow who focuses on covering Latinx communities and politics. Adriana has bylines in Refinery 29, Ms. Magazine, Pop Sugar, and Syracuse.com, and is passionate about bilingual storytelling. So thanks to Ghael and Adriana for your leadership tonight, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you. All right, so I guess, maybe I'll just stand up here for a second here. Welcome everybody, thank you so much for coming. I know a lot of you are in the process of thinking about finals, so I know that this is just an addition to that, so we hope to make it a little bit lively. I'm here to introduce David Graham. He is a staff writer with The Atlantic. He won our National Toner Prize last year for his outstanding political reporting. I think here I have a few of the slides. See some of the stories that he did over the past year. One of the most interesting things when you get a chance if you haven't read the stories already, you'll see the dateline of them, and you'll see that many of the issues that ended up coming up after the campaign, issues relating to ballot access and counting, were things that he kind of previewed. Pretty timely stuff. David comes to The Atlantic from Newsweek, where he was a writer and a reporter and a researcher. He's been at The Atlantic for 10 years now, and he is based in North Carolina, but soon to be moving.
All right. And I'm here to introduce our local reporting Toner Prize winners. So we've got Sara Satullo, who is a local government and data reporter at LehighValleyLive.com, also known as the Express Times, right? And then we've got Steve Novak, who is a general assignment reporter, and they're both here for winning for their project Swing County, Swing State, which focused on what is known as Northampton County in the Lehigh Valley, and this is a county that flip-flops a lot, but it's also known as a bellwether. So it's predicted who's going to be the presidential, who's going to be the president a lot of the times, but also predicted who's going to win Pennsylvania most of the time. So they'll be able to talk more about the stats and whatnot. So thank you guys for being here. We'll just jump right into the discussion.
You can see here, I just wanted to give people a little bit of a visual look at some of the Lehigh Valley reporting. I pulled it up. Out here. So you see this is blue to red. I could only do a screen grab here. I'm going to actually go to the website itself, and you will see.
So essentially what they did was, they'll talk more about it, but they used a specific road in the Lehigh Valley in Northampton County and to display sort of like how polarized this county is, but also how there's people in the middle, right? And it's the visual that they used was like, if you drive through this road, you'll start with Biden on one end and end up with a lot of Trump supporters on the other end. So we can talk about how you guys even conceived to follow a road, but let's just jump into it. And if you have questions in the audience, please we'll have a Q&A section later on, and feel free to hold on to your question. We'll try to get to you. All right, so Ghael, you want to jump into it?
Yep. There we go. Definitely wanted to just give a look at just how extensive some of that reporting was. I think definitely worth checking out for everyone after the fact. Yeah, so I wanted to start just with a conversation with David at first on sometimes when we think about political reporting, we think, okay, we're covering campaigns, we're covering candidates. And one of the things you immediately realize in just reading your pieces is that a lot of it is about the mechanics of an election. And I think a lot of us have been thrown into this crash course of learning what comprises counting of ballots, just the production of mail-in ballots, and the process that goes behind that and the implications of that. And I just wanted to have you explain to us the importance that you saw early on when you were deciding to do those stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was both a matter of necessity and a matter of good luck. The necessity was there weren't the same sort of candidates weren't traveling in the same way, and so the ability to go to a rally and talk to people wasn't there. And on the other hand, I had been interested in things like voter ID laws and voting mechanics for a long time, which is the sort of thing that does not typically attract a lot of readers. But suddenly I had this very lucky moment where people are interested in it. And it just seemed, by the spring or the summer that this was going to be really important as states were reworking their voting laws to respond to the pandemic. You had the president already out, saying the election was rigged and sort of reprising things he'd said 4 years previously, but much more strongly. And so I sort of jumped into these things that I knew about. And, there were, in a lot of cases, I knew, I had sources who were really useful on them, but I didn't, I wrote a piece about signature matching on ballots, which I didn't know anything about that, but it turned out to be something that, Trump talked about a lot, and it was important. And it was just fascinating for me to learn about, and hopefully it was fascinating for readers too.
Yeah.
Well, it was good enough to win a prize. So, Sara, Steve, set the scene for us. What was the feeling in Pennsylvania, but in Northampton County specifically, and how did that inspire how you went about the project and what you chose to cover?
So, Northampton County is a very place-centric sort of county, and depending on what community you are in, it has a very distinct identity. So you could spend a lot of time in Bethlehem, like where I live, and I mean, it would be hard to find a Trump sign, but then you drive 5 miles outside of the city and you are in Williams Township, where it is just Trump signs left and right. So it could sometimes feel a little bit like whiplash of, I'm not really sure who's up, who's down. And one of the unique opportunities we had with this project that we haven't had in prior elections was to do a lot of polling in the community. That helped us get a bit of a pulse. But I mean, I think by the time election day came around, we were like, this could go, either way. We knew it was going to kind of be a nail biter. And we felt pretty confident that our conceit that whoever won Northampton County would win the White House was going to bear out. But I mean, we didn't know who was that was going to be. We didn't know who it was going to be, but we also didn't realize it was going to be basically Northampton County was going to be the national picture, that it was going to be exactly as close. Everything just bore out the same way. That we would see the results come in for Biden, flipping some of the suburban townships that he needed to, and that's what bore out across the country. It was fascinating to watch it actually all play out right in our homes.
And can you just quickly tell us so that they sort of know what Northampton's history is? So they've accurately predicted the presidential winner all but 3 times, right?
In the last 100 years. And part of the project was that we digitized the election records going back 100 years, which was a lot greater of an undertaking than I realized when I started out. I figured out why nobody had done it, because the last 20 years were literally handwritten books that we sent in, one of our sports reporters actually, because they're really good with stats and numbers, to go in and go through and put them into spreadsheets and digitize them. But it gave us this really depth of knowledge to be able to look at how the community has changed over time down to the precinct level. So we could really see how these national trends were playing out locally. And I think it lent authority to our reporting that we wouldn't have been able to project without that data.
Wow.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm curious about, and you guys, I mean, you saw it play out in real time. Election night became election week. And I think in some ways it's kind of the merging of both of your prizes, right? And one thing that I've been particularly curious about, just as a student reporter, I think a lot of people in the audience probably have had the difficulty of sources aren't, and I've noticed this more recently in the pandemic, just aren't as willing to talk. There's a certain distrust that I even feel as covering stuff for class. I'm curious if during an election and during a pandemic, the three of you saw that it was harder to talk to voters, maybe it was easier. I'm curious your thoughts, and maybe since the election, has it been any more difficult or any easier?
Who wants to take that one first? Come on.
Do you want to go national and go?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it was a lot harder to talk to voters just on a mechanical level, certainly. It's harder to find them when, rallies are just so easy. You can find hundreds or thousands of people who want to talk about politics. No one wants to talk about politics, but you go to a rally and everyone wants to talk about politics. It's so easy. It's really great. And when you don't have that, it's very, it's much harder. But there is also this real problem of trust, and it's polarized. It was easy to find Biden voters or perhaps anti-Trump voters who wanted to tell you how much they hated the president, which is just not that interesting or helpful after a certain point. And it was much harder to find people who supported the president to talk to you because they distrusted the media. And I think that was a real challenge, and that is one thing that drove me towards writing the sorts of stories I did. I think that is harder even now than it was maybe not a year ago, but harder than it was 15 months ago. People are even stauncher in those things, and I find one of the things that attracted me about the Atlantic when I started working there was that while it has an overall sort of liberal bent, it has always been very open to a lot of viewpoints and had a readership that was very diverse. And I sense just from the sorts of emails that I get that the readership is not so diverse, and that I find that sad. And I think about how to get around that, and I don't know how to do that.
Would you say finding voters to talk to was the biggest challenge that you've encountered in political reporting recently?
I don't know if it's the biggest challenge.
What would be the biggest challenge?
Talking to voters can be really helpful, and you get such interesting things from them, and they're so unpredictable. We have this idea of what voters are like, and when you talk to real people, they don't fit. They're not stereotypes. Like, people have interesting views, and they're all over the place. And so I didn't, because I wasn't talking to a lot of voters. Like, what I was then trying to do was convey complicated concepts about voting technologies in a way that was clear, which is a totally different kind of challenge. I have a hard time figuring out what's a bigger challenge. It's sort of what's on the plate today.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Steve and Sara? What was it like trying to talk to voters who maybe did not trust the media that much?
It was tough, first off, to finding them, and thank you to the students who were helping us with that. But it got to a point where for Blue to Red in 30 miles, I was literally going door to door. I was leaving my business card and a note in people's doors and mailboxes, just waiting for someone to call me back. I probably went out there 3 or 4 times before I finally got someone who was like, "Oh yeah, I'll talk to you, sure, why not?" Invited me and Saeed Hindash, our photographer, into his house, just talked with us for over an hour about his family's history in the area and why he thought Trump was the guy. But it also kind of surprised me a little bit, on the other end, finding the Biden supporters too, someone who would be willing to go on record, especially because people didn't want to put their business at risk just for the sake of politics. And eventually just would go, keep calling, keep asking people, be like, "Oh, you don't want to talk, but who do you think would? And they'd be like, oh, you got to talk to this guy with the soul food kitchen, down the road here. Okay, sure. And that's how I got around to finally getting all the people that I needed. And then there was also just one occasion where it was literally a guy on the street saw me with a camera and was like, hey, come talk to me.
Have you followed up with anyone in fact? Have they shared like, hey, because I talked to you, my business has suffered, or have you not heard about anything like that?
It's something I've wanted to do for a while, and I just haven't, and I really should, so maybe this will get me to do that.
Mm-hmm. That was an interesting thing, though, that Steve found that there were businesses that were willing to put on the side of a massive barn, like a Trump sign, but when you would go to talk to them, it was like, so they were willing to, kind of broadcast it to their community in that way, but not like via the media. And for us to, because we weren't going to rallies and lots of in-person events, and generally it was at a time where, we were coming into the worst part of the pandemic to that point that people weren't too keen on you showing up unannounced, knocking on their door. And I mean, I also wasn't too keen on doing that, so kudos to Steve.
I'm not sure how many of them like seeing the mask either in some areas of the county.
Yeah, there was that as well. But so we started trying to get creative, which Steve alluded to a little bit. We put out, in addition, a part of our polling that we paid for, we used, asked them if they'd be willing to contact it by a reporter. And then we put out a Google form survey, which is on our social channels, published it on our website. And that's something we had a lot of success with. We got over 200 responses, and then Adriana and some other Newhouse students in Dean Kaplan's class called and vetted all of them for us, and that really then helped us single in the folks that we ended up profiling in our reporting. So I think you guys probably dealt with a little bit of the pushback more than we did, but our biggest challenge was finding Trump voters, and it continues to be a challenge to get them to speak to us, because there's a great distrust and a big divide in just like basic facts as to who won the election and how that played out. And that's a big challenge today as a journalist, how to navigate that.
Mm-hmm. On the ground, I'm just curious from the Pennsylvania point of view, I think we talk about certain politicians kind of deviating from reality when it comes to just the fact that Biden won the election, and I wonder, when you're approaching voters, did you sense that it was almost immediate after just like a week after the election? Like, did you sense it percolating, or did you sense it take time? Afterward, or like how quick was it that voters began to just really catch on to the myth that there was widespread fraud?
I can tell you the first time that I experienced it was the McCloskeys came to speak in Northampton County. It was probably back in, that must have been early September of that year.
McCloskey is the couple in St. Louis that with the gun.
Yes.
Yes.
So they were doing a GOP rally event, which was probably one of the most unusual experiences that I've had as a local reporter, where they had an escort of bikers who came up and then tried to block all of our cameras and stop us from watching the event. But the lead up to that was the county GOP chairperson basically saying, and something about and they're setting up these ballot drop boxes. And that was it. She didn't say anything about fraud, but people started booing. Like, just the mention of drop boxes had people going out of their minds. But that was a specific event, too, that I think drew a specific section of people going out and talking to people at their homes. It didn't feel that way. It didn't feel anything like that, for me at least.
I feel like it was like a slow burn. Like I was telling David that his Blue Shift story, when I first read it, when it published, I was like, this is what's going to happen in Pennsylvania. Just because of all of the controversy that we were seeing around our mail-in process that was coming in for the first time in the pandemic, the politicization of that. And I mean, we kept a spreadsheet going, keeping track of how many mail-in ballots have been requested, broken down by party, because we knew. And election night, it started becoming, it was a mathematical equation. Like, there were only so many ballots left, and there's only, I mean, that's why Steve Kornacki became so popular and everybody's favorite, like, gap-khaki guy in the 1 week afterwards. But I would say the first time I actually realized that I was talking to a friend in Arizona who is a big Trump supporter, and she was saying to me, what's going on in your state? Like, they're talking about your county, like, what are they doing? And I was like, well, here's the link to them counting the ballots, and you can watch them. And she's like, there's something not right. Like, there's just something not right here. And I said, Jen, eventually, they can't call it yet, but it's going to end up being Biden. Like, it's a basic math equation. And she was like, I know how to do math. And she, kind of dismissed me and told me that she had sources on the ground. And I was like, okay, we're going into a new world. So I think this, like, the seeds of distrust were planted for months leading up to it. And I don't think if Trump had won, we would be seeing what we were seeing today.
So essentially, like, if Trump had won, you don't think that the Democrats would have been calling the election rigged? Like, you think it was specifically coming from the Trump electorate?
Well, I think that the president, really started first. Mm-hmm. Like, he talked about it in 2016, but he really ramped it up to a different level that I think then started having a real effect on people's trust in the election process.
And I think that the ballot box question thing is so interesting that people knew that what that was and immediately started booing, because it's like there was this thing that happened in Trump rallies and also with some Trump surrogates, where if you sort of weren't immersed in the right conservative media environment, it would be impossible to tell what they were talking about. It was as though they were talking in code. But people were consuming this from these particular outlets, and they knew what all these catchphrases were. They knew what they were, and they could just be shorthanded for somebody like Trump. And that sunk in so early for it to work. I mean, Trump was saying in 2016 before the election that the election was rigged, and he mostly stopped after the election, although still not entirely. He continued to claim, 3 million illegal immigrant voters or whatever. But that's what happened when he won. So he laid the same groundwork even more the second time around, and people were really primed for it.
One of the things that I think most struck me, David, was some of your coverage after January 6th. And interestingly, the way that the prize works and when people submit is it was actually kind of the week after. January 6th was when submissions come in for the prize. And you had a tweet that night that I think, to me, it's pinned at the top of your profile, and it's like, it was something that I keep on being reminded of constantly, and it's, remember what today was like. Someone might try to convince you it was different very soon. There's some precedence there. I mean, to this day, we have politicians who are consistently trying to tell us that what happened before cameras in plain daylight did not happen in the way that we saw it. Do we hold certain politicians to a certain standard to a different standard because they seemingly say these things repeatedly? Like, I wonder how you all weigh that when some politicians aren't appreciating reality and some are, and you're trying to cover that in some sort of meaningful way. That's a big question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think we the media, which is like kind of a weird construction, are still wrestling with that, and it's hard to know what to do with that. A researcher who I really love is a guy named Brendan Nyhan. One of the stories I submitted is based on research Nyhan did, and he does a lot on fact checking and mistaken beliefs, and he talks about, like, you don't when you repeat falsehoods, you reinforce them. Even if you're debunking them, by repeating them, you reinforce them. And so it's a really tough challenge. Like, if somebody's saying something that's false, you want to debunk it, you want to set the record straight, but even by doing so, you run a risk. And, I have some leeway, I think, because The Atlantic is kind of a voicey publication. I've had some leeway to be like, that's nonsense for a long time. And I think as in the post-January 6th era, more outlets are sort of feeling freed up to say that, but like that's also, there are risks to that, and We're talking about the problem of Trump voters not trusting us, and if we say what they believe is nonsense, they will trust us less. But it is nonsense, so we can't not say that. I mean, I feel like I'm stuck in a trap.
Yeah, you can't win. There's like no easy solution to it, because you want to do reporting that all members of the electorate trust, but when certain members of the electorate are operating in an alternate factual reality where they think the facts that you're operating in are a lie, I don't know how you bridge that gap, and I think that's something we're still very much trying to negotiate and determine, like, when you call it out, and debating a lot more of whether or not you covered something. The trick now is that, like, back when newspapers and magazines were the only game in town, we got to be like the information gatekeepers, and we could say, like, that's a fringe thing, we're not going to cover it. But when it starts getting out into blogs and onto podcasts and onto Twitter, and we keep ignoring it, that reinforces the idea that, like, we're part of this conspiracy theory. So I don't think anybody has a good solution yet to this problem.
That's kind of what played out with in Northampton County in the most recent election. We were talking about this before, like that we had a county executive who was running, who would just spout off actual nonsense, who had no idea how county. He was a Republican candidate. He was running with no idea how county government worked, and thought that and actually went viral for saying that we're going to get 20 strong men together and we're going to go oust any school board that approved mask mandates, and we'll replace them that night, and we'll overturn the mandates themselves. And it's like, you can't do that. He had been talking about things, nonsensical things before that, but we kind of figured, okay, we're just gonna let that go for a little while because he's just saying things. Then it turned to that. It's like, okay, now it sounds like he's advocating for something physical, real, potentially violent. It's like, we have to address this now. So I don't know if we did the right thing, ignoring his statements before that and just kind of letting them, trying not to give them oxygen. But I don't know. Like, I just don't know what to do in that sort of situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we had a lot of internal debate about, like, what's the best way to handle that. And we were late to getting this story up. Like, it was viral long before we wrote it. But it was kind of like, we'd rather try to have the right internal dialogue. And that can be a challenge today when you feel like you're being late on a story that's making national headlines in your backyard. But ultimately, I think it was more important that, we did the right thing by our audience and what we felt was like the right thing for the community that we serve.
And for that specific story, we were trying to put it into some kind of context, not just letting the comments out there to stand, but to actually get experts in there saying, like, no, this is not something that can be done. And I should also clarify that, like, we did intend to address his nonsensical comments, like, eventually in sort of an election roundup, but maybe it went a little too far. Getting to that point, I don't know.
So I want to talk a little bit more about your project specifically, and you mentioned it, but for those of you who don't know, Newhouse actually played a role in this project. So students from Dean Kaplan's political reporting class called a lot of voters in Northampton County and tried to get them to talk to Lehigh Valley Live. I think you guys had around like 200 names, contact info for voters that had said they would be willing to, and then it was the students' job to vet them, kind of ask them questions like, who did you vote for in 2016? Who are you voting for now? Try to get a sense if there was a story there. But there's a particular story that you wrote, Steve, that is based on Route 248. And I'll read a quick quote. So Northampton County isn't red, it isn't blue, it's purple. And an hour's drive will show you why. Pennsylvania State Route 248 spans this crucial swing state county through all political subgroups. So I'm curious, why do you think it was so effective to use Route 248 to paint the complexity of Northampton County? And how did you plan that reporting in advance? Did you just hop in your car and drive down 248?
A little bit. That did play a little bit of a role there. The idea for the road story was actually pitched to me by Nick Falsoni, our editor, who said, "I want you to pursue this, like make this happen."
And you're grateful you did, so.
Yes, that really worked out. But it made
Editors
sense.
are good sometimes. Sometimes.
Most of the time.
But it made sense immediately. Like, we know where this road goes. We all, like, the reporters have driven it tons of times. We know it starts in a city, it ends way out in the sticks, and we know everything it passes through. Like, this was going to, we just knew that was the right road to do.
I think because it like bisects the county, like you can drive it in a pretty short period of time and you can see all of the facets of Northampton County as you go through it. The rural, urban, suburban, you know, like you can hit all of it in a short period and hit every sort of voter theoretically. So the hope was that we could illustrate that.
10 minutes out of the city, you're in the suburbs, you're going through all the shopping malls, strip malls. There's a cement plant in the distance. There's 5 more cement plants in the distance. Now you're out in the woods, rolling hills, farms, drive-in theater, and you're then like at the end.
And this is where you did most of the door knocking, right?
Yes.
That's how you ended up finding sources.
So I must have driven that road. I don't know how many times. I don't think they appreciated my expense reports very much that month. But that's just what I did. Like, okay, let's see where this goes. What are good neighborhoods to stop at? I knew that I would have to deviate a little bit off the road in Nazareth because we really wanted to hit Nazareth. That's right in the middle. It's a much smaller town. That actually has been a good scene of the national parachuting in. We wanted to do it our way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we also want to open this up for audience members to have questions. So I think we will pass the mic around here. If please raise your hands and we can try and get it over to you. Or actually, maybe if you want to come down, maybe that's actually easier. Let's see. And if you just want to say your name and maybe your grade or something like that.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Marnie Munoz. I'm a junior here studying magazine news and digital journalism and international relations. So I've done a lot of work with local reporting since I got to school here. It's been my training ground for the work that I want to do after I graduate. Still deciding on which kind of region and which kind of community that I do want to serve, particularly with my reporting. But my question would be, I'm curious, as national reporters and as local reporters, what your relationship is like to each other. I know that there's a lot of conversation about parachute journalism, as you were mentioning before, but as a national reporter, what is your relationship like with local reporters when you're setting out to do a story that covers a specific community that you may not live in or have a lot of context knowledge of? And for yourselves, when you're covering a story with this kind of national magnitude, what was your communication like with national reporters?
Oh, they're pitting you against each other.
I mean, we're kind of parasitic, like no question. When you are parachuting in, it is such a danger zone. It is so easy. I said earlier that voters are surprising, and it's so easy to come in with a preconceived notion and just sort of like write that. You can find something to back up whatever frame you come in with if you try hard enough and if you don't really pay attention. And I think trying to read as much of the local coverage as possible, but not just be ripping it off and to like use that as a guide, but not to be too parasitic is really a challenge. I probably sound uncomfortable, and it's because I am. Because I like this is something that I think is really awkward. A question of like, do you reach out to the local reporters? How are they going to feel about that? Are they going to feel like you're coming in and bigfooting them, or are they going to want to talk about it and you don't know? depends on the place, depends on the reporter. I think it's a really uncomfortable relationship. I like a lot of national political reporting is kind of boring and repetitive, and the local reporting is often much more interesting and much more valuable. So I think it's so important. I mean, I see things like what they do as sort of heroic. Like what I'm doing is not that hard. This is the real stuff.
That was very kind. What I think, though, that you're right, that some national reporting can fall into rote, like, forms of, and what the thing that was so remarkable about what David is that he took what could be very boring, esoteric subjects and made them so accessible and, like, predicted what was going to become the issue. And that's why it was valuable to me to start, like, laying the groundwork, like, this is the background knowledge that I need to have. We need to make sure we're staying on top of and tracking the mail-in ballots and breaking them down by registration and finding out, like, how many can they process in a day, and going into the county courthouse and literally watching them stuff the ballots and have them walk me through the whole process and what the county is going to look like, so I can have that authority of information. If I had not read that Blue Shift article, I don't know if I would have done half of that. So that, like, those are the kind of things that, like, I'm looking to see what those national trends are, and, like, I have enough knowledge of my community that I'm covering to know whether or not it's going to be relevant to our audience and what we are doing.
So I'm sorry about the parachute thing. That wasn't a reference to you.
No. I didn't take it to me, but it would be fair if it were also.
But yeah, like the stuff you do, what Sara said, it provides the context that we need to know how much of, like, our local reporting is, like, how big of an impact is this? How important is this that we're doing? Because a lot of the local stuff can be very, very boring too. let's not kid ourselves there. Yeah, zoning board meetings, woohoo. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that we need to build our framework. Like, things that are happening nationally are happening locally. Here's why. The Blue Shift is a brilliant example, because you did predict exactly what happened, and that is the piece that, like, got me thinking about it as well.
One thing that I had forgot that kind of plays into that I had mentioned earlier at our dinner was talking about national and international reporters coming in. There was a very nice team of BBC documentary journalists that were in Northampton County. And if you're not familiar with the Bethlehem area, I mean, it was the world headquarters for Bethlehem Steel. It was where America was made, if you will, and we had lots of garment mills and lots of cement. The one thing we did not have was any coal mining. And she is like, I really would like to do a phone call with you. And at first I was kind of like I am a reporter that if you were coming in and reached out to me, I would appreciate the effort and the respect for, like, my knowledge of the area. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll talk to you. And she's like, I can't find any coal miners. Can you help me find the coal miners? And I was like, there aren't coal miners. This is not a coal mining region. So that's where sometimes people can go a bit astray.
So step one, be well informed. Do we have any other questions from the audience? They don't bite, we promise. So I think while we wait for the next question, I'm curious on the same topic, what are the steps that a national reporter can take to avoid coming in with these, like, preconceived notions that might deviate their reporting and not make it as fair as it should be? Like, essentially, how do you avoid parachuting in is the question.
I mean, I think reading the local coverage is helpful, so you know kind of what you're walking into. I think coming in, and this is something for any journalist, is coming in and being willing to say what you don't know. Coming in and trying to prove how smart you are is not going to get you a good story or get you anywhere. It's going to actually get you a bad story. So I think it's really coming in, being humble, and doing research to understand what was the major industry, what is the major employer now, And then that can help you ask the right questions. And just generally in reporting, I always ask at the end, is there anything that I forgot to ask you that you think is important? And sometimes I get the best stuff because you don't know what you don't know. And asking, who else do you think I should talk to about this? Who do you think would be a good person? And if you can get that one community person, like the guy that's running the soul food shop that everybody goes to and everybody knows, he can tell you every single interesting person in the community.
I don't know if this is actually a good practice, but maybe just the way I have sort of jerry-rigged it. But I often try to make a trip like almost the last stage in my story. By the time I go somewhere, I want to have a pretty good sense of, I want to talk to a lot of people. I want to have hours of interview under my belt, so I know what I'm going into, and like a bunch of different people. And I want to know the people I'm going to try to find when I get there and where I'm going to find them. By the time you arrive, you should know whether or not they're coal miners. You can make that mistake on your first phone call, but don't make that by the time your boots are on the ground. Like, that's way too late.
Mm-hmm.
These are good strategies for reporting on any level, I should say, not just national, like going into local. It's you need to do this anytime.
Well, I'm gonna put you on the spot for your County Politan article going into Union County. Was that your framework before you went there? How did you find those people?
Just explain just a little bit about the article to everybody as well.
Okay, so I did a story on a county outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, called Union County. That is an interesting. There are counties like this all over the place that are formerly rural but are rapidly suburbanizing as sort of sprawl comes out, and that's creating interesting changes in the politics. So this particular county was the home of Jesse Helms, the famous or infamous North Carolina senator, long before probably most of you were born. But also has all this suburban sprawl, and the people moving out from the city tend to be more liberal. They want lower taxes, but they also are not, they're not the same flavor of conservative, and this creates interesting political dynamics, especially when we saw the suburbs moving toward the Democratic Party. And so that was a story where I basically called a bunch of my favorite North Carolina political experts, and I was like, what's the most interesting place I can go? This is sort of a response to parachute journalism, is because you'd see, I saw lots of national journalists sort of parachuting in and writing stories on the North Carolina Senate race, for example, or on the gubernatorial race. And I thought those stories were kind of boring, partly because I lived there. Like, of course I thought that. Like, they weren't written for me. But I was like, well, I should write a good North Carolina story, but I don't know what to try. Sort of calling those, where is interesting? Where should I go? That will tell me something interesting about the state. And I called a former strategist who's a professor, and he said, oh, I've got this idea about this description of these counties as countrypolitan, after a sort of subgenre of country from the 60s and 70s, and you should go to Union County, and here's what you should look for. And so I said, well, that's cool, thanks, Mac. And then I called up some other people, and I said, Mac says I should go to Union County. Oh, yeah, go there. That's the place to go. And then I started calling political strategists in the area. So by the time I went, I knew I had a lot of the sort of the substance. And what I needed to know was like what actually looks like on the ground, what it's like to be there. That you can't, you just can't get that from reporting on the phone from down the road. And I wanted to talk to people on the street. And so I was, I knew which sort of communities to go to and what street to go to, and what I might look for in those kinds of places. And then I was sort of just like trying to get folks to talk to me, which fell into all the sort of challenges of getting voters to talk that we saw before. But I had, most of the framework was there, and I felt like I had a pretty good handle on the macro dynamics of the county by the time I got in the car.
There we have a question. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm curious, as political reporters, that you go in obviously having your own bias and your own thoughts about these subjects that you're studying and talking about. One, how do you keep that yourself out of it? And two, when you did this reporting, did you have any surprises that challenged your own beliefs on certain things? And I'm hoping you'll say yes, or maybe we're not as divided as we seem, but I am an optimist, so.
You also have to introduce yourself.
Oh.
I mean, you have to.
My name's Jess Novak, that's my brother. And I went to SU as well. I was a gold ring student, so I was a music journalist, which is very simple compared to all of this. But yeah, I admire what you do.
Still necessary though, music journalism. Steve, you want to take this one?
We admire what you do too, Jess. All right, so what was the question again? I'm sorry.
Anything that's
Did
surprising.
you find things that challenge your beliefs, and how did you keep yourself out of it, your own beliefs?
Yeah, you're always going into something with your own preconceived notions of what you're going to encounter. And it seems like very rarely do they actually play out exactly the way you think they will. So I think my biggest example of that was probably when I was talking to, for both our family profiles and for Blue to Red in 30 Miles. It was the guy who encountered me on the street. His name was Johnny Rodriguez. He was a Trump supporter, and he just straight up told me, he's like, oh yeah, and my mom thinks I'm crazy. And I'm like, okay, well, I got to talk to you more now. So I ended up going back talking with him more, with our photographer, and then I had over an hour just sitting down with him. And it wasn't an interview really, it was a conversation. He was asking me about what I thought about stuff, and I was honest with him. And he was honest with me too. It's really easy to get this idea in your head of what a Trump supporter is, or what a Biden supporter is for that matter, just based off of social media and off of other coverage, off of national news or rallies or this or that. And then to actually sit and talk with somebody, and he's like, yeah, I don't like what Trump says. I think he comes across as a bully sometimes. I don't think he should say half the stuff he does. But the economy was pretty good until COVID, and it's like, okay, well, most people, at least when they're talking to you one-on-one as a person, they don't have all the other baggage, and at least not obviously. You see them, it's easier to see them more as a person.
I think when you're interviewing people the way we did for this project, it humanizes them. And like when the rally reporting that used to be the staple of political reporting, it's easy to let people fall into stereotypes because you're talking to them for 5 minutes. But when somebody like welcomes you into their home in the middle of a pandemic and you're having to sit 6 feet apart in a mask and really taking like a risk to be in the room together, that I think that kind of melts away a lot of differences. And I think what helped, like especially with this, our whole goal was to not fall into those stereotypes. So I really went into it with an open mind, and I was very surprised by many people. And it's very interesting to hear as somebody that's very politically connected and tapped in and following, like, you know, every little tweet development of the election, of how disconnected people can be and what filters through to them and what reaches them and what influences their beliefs. So I think just the level of intimacy we had with a lot of the subjects was very helpful. But you don't always get that. You don't always get that luxury at that time.
David, that was actually one of the things I immediately found in your piece on Wisconsin, and just thinking about like, oftentimes where the election is fought is amongst the voters who don't go to rallies, right? It's like the people who least want to talk about politics are the people who are deciding politics. I'm just curious from your perspective and maybe through your Wisconsin piece, did you find that when you're trying to string together a voter, right, and in some ways, like, you only have so much space in a piece to basically like fill out a human being and all of their complexities. How do you go about picking and choosing the kind of characters that you will fit into one of your pieces?
That's a really good question, and I have to think about how to answer it. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of you have to, like, voters are endlessly complicated. You know, like they just aren't what we think. Just like Sarah was saying, it's you know to a certain extent you have some kind of archetype. I mean, I think I spend a lot of time looking at polling data to try to discern what they're, you know, what are tranches of voters. So I have an idea of what a kind of broad kind of voter I'm looking for, maybe. So that's part of it. And then the other side is just like, who's interesting? You know, they're, you know, like the guy's like, hey, I want to talk to you. Like, those people are, you know, when there's somebody like that, you're going to talk to them. And sometimes that can be dangerous. There's a little bit of a squeaky wheel getting the grease situation. but sometimes it's like the people who want to talk to you are often really interesting, and once you get talking to them, they are endlessly complex too. So a little bit of it's just chance and willingness.
Any other questions from the audience? Oh, we got a taker. You can say your name and your year.
Hi, I'm Tim Miller. I'm a sophomore photo major. And that I kind of wanted to ask something about what you just said with like the whole squeaky wheel gets the oil. How do you deal with that? Because if you come in with an objective report, but only a certain amount of people will talk to you, that makes bias, even if you don't want it. So how do you deal with that?
I think that's a huge problem for national political reporting in general. I mean, we're so poll dependent now, and as we saw in 2020, the polls just have a lot of flaws because of who will talk to pollsters too. And any reporter who thinks they're not encountering the same non-response problems on a micro level that pollsters have is sorely victim to hubris. I don't know. I mean, I think I try to make sure that I'm talking to people with a lot of different viewpoints, and I try to integrate that, and I try to make sure that I have as much sort of quantitative support for what I'm doing. But there's a little bit of a wing and a prayer on it. I mean, you hope that you have the right people, and you hope you're getting the right impression. You're flattening everything. I mean, there's just no way in any story of any length to not flatten things. So you sort of try your best and hope you're not flattening the wrong things. You're not flattening it in the wrong way.
You got to trust your gut a lot in this situation too, with just depending on what they're saying and how they're saying it, and just kind of you get a vibe from people, and that's just something that you develop after talking with people for a lot of time. You kind of begin to sense like, okay, what's your motivation? Sometimes you just flat out ask, like, what's your angle here? You don't always get an honest answer, but it can sometimes help, just you
might get a telling answer if you don't get an honest answer.
That's true.
I mean, they say like trust but verify, and like Steve literally called that guy's mom to talk to her to find out. So sometimes you have to do that.
Mom corroborated everything he said.
This is a little bit tangential, I guess, to what you're saying, but I've been trying in a project I'm working on now on affordable housing is to build trust in a community that's largely Latinx that we have ignored in our coverage. And it's not like the Trump supporter where they're very distrustful of the media, but we're just not their source of information and news. And I've been doing a lot of community engagement work. Like for the first time, I'm holding a lot of focus sessions where everything is off the record and just on background, which is something I've never done before. And we were even compensating people for their time with gift cards and providing them dinner, just to build community trust that has like reaped dividends for me later on in the reporting process when I sent out Google Form surveys. I was trying to find renters in like who were getting evicted and in the moratorium crisis, and like some of those people from those initial focus sessions were crucial to sending that out into the community and helping me find the sources. And that's something that we don't always have the luxury of doing. I have a fellowship and grant right now that's allowing me to do that. But I think in some ways of trying to diversify, like the way that we've traditionally done things, is a way to try to combat that and try to bring in voices that may have been overlooked in our coverage.
I think we probably have one time.
Steve, were you
Sorry, I was just going to say also, like, when you are going into those situations and you're listening to the answers and getting the gut feeling, you do sometimes get burned. It happens, and it's unfortunate, and you learn from the experience too. So don't want to ignore that that's part of the reality of it.
Yeah, I mean, if someone has a burning
There we
thought,
go, yeah.
then I think we got time for that. But
For one final quick question.
yeah.
You can say your name and year, please.
My name is Anthony. I'm a sophomore broadcast journalism major. My question was, when you're, specifically for political reporting, so like when you're going into an area that's very biased toward one side or the other, how do you avoid writing biased because that's all of your sources are going to be a certain mindset, a certain way.
David, do you want to take that one first?
It's almost easier when everybody is sort of on the same side, because you know what you're going for. You know what you're going to get, and then you're sort of trying to understand the nuances, and you're trying to understand how people think. When you're going to a place that's divided, and you're trying to get a good balance and get a representative sample, I find that harder. But if you know sort of generally what people are like, you can sort of let your guard down and be like, this is who I am, this is what I'm interested in, and I'd like to talk to you. And maybe they will, and maybe they won't, but sometimes I find that a little bit easier.
How do you balance publishing, like when you have a lot of sources, for example, like the Trump voters spew a lot of the same misinformation that the president did. So how do you figure out, like, should I even quote them on this when they're saying that the election was a hoax? Because then I'm publishing that misinformation. How do you make that decision on what to publish and what not to?
I ask my editor.
Okay.
I think it's a tough question. That's a question that we have to discuss as an editor and reporter relationship, as a newsroom and as a business. Like, those are things that we need to talk about. I don't think there's a set answer, and I think it's a moving target. We just have to keep thinking about how we can best handle that.
Context is everything. It's if that quote is the story that someone is saying that it's a hoax, like, obviously you have to put it in there, but
You have
it's
to have
where
a solid nut graph.
right, exactly. But it's where so much of your national reporting comes to help us too. That, like, okay, we can link to this story, this story, this story, this story, showing these sources of information, these other outlets, other places, like, and showing this is not what it actually is, but it's important to know that this person said this.
I think we have gotten, as an industry, a little bit more comfortable with calling things out that are factually incorrect. And one of my favorite parts of the Union County piece was when, I don't even remember exactly what the guy said, but then, like, you say something along the lines of, it was not entirely clear whether he believed what he said or if it was tongue in cheek or like whatever, like. And instead of, like, leaving him out, or like you were just upfront, like, this is what I know and this is what I don't know, take it as it is. I think sometimes bringing down that veil of the reporting process and that divide and that wall between the audience can be helpful.
Great. Well, I think we now pass it on to Dean Kaplan, right? Everybody give us a hand for 3 prize winners. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you so much for being here. We hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for moderating.
Yeah, no, of course.
We got
Dean Kaplan?
surprises.
Thank you. Joel Kaplan, Associate Dean, and we want to thank, first of all, our 2 moderators here for coming up with this. A little gift from us. I don't think there's any gift cards in here, but there's something else perhaps that you can use. But just remembrance of your time. Thank you so much for coming up from Lehigh Valley and for flying in from North Carolina. There you go.
And thank you.